Well, those of you who are especially eagle-eyed may have noticed that I'm not Camellia. I'm Alan Schoenfeld, and it's my pleasure to introduce Niral Shah, who is our speaker today. I asked Niral what I should say, or maybe what I shouldn't say, and he just said, go ahead and do your thing. So if I accidentally deliver his talk, that's your problem, I guess. Now I'll try to steer away from the details. Let me tell you a little bit about Niral, and then something that I thought of this morning that makes a connection to Niral's work. Niral got his bachelor's in economics and computer science from the University of Pennsylvania in 2002, but he was distracted from the mercenary course of going into business and making money because he had spent some time in schools and saw the terrible conditions and decided he needed to do something about that. So he went off and became a teacher, and he taught in the Richmond Unified School District, which is tough and in which the math department was not in very good shape. Within a few years, he became department chair, was known for having turned the department around, and won a county-wide award for teaching. So what do you do after that? You come to Cal for graduate school. He said, basically, I need to know more, I need to do more. And he had the good taste not to go down to the farm, but to come here instead. And work on issues that he's going to tell you about, so I won't, which have to do with race, learning, and identity, how racial narratives mediate learning in mathematics. What I want to do is tell you about a connection I made this morning that is another reason you should take Niral's work seriously if you wonder, why are things like this important? For fun, I've been reading Danny Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. And it's an interesting book. Kahneman's an interesting guy. And one of the things he talks about, he reviews some of the ancient literature, which for some of you is stuff written 4 or 5 years ago. He goes about 40 years back. And he goes back to the early psychological literature on priming. How many of you have heard about that? I know you have. Okay. Back when psychologists first got the technology that allowed them to measure things in milliseconds, so they gave you a prompt. The word flashes up on the screen, and as soon as you recognize it, you push a button. They went hog wild doing experiments, and it turned out that the experiments validated a form of associative memory that was interesting. Words are linked in various ways in our brains, and it turns out that they have recognition thresholds, and they're connected to other words. So if I flash the word ROSE, rose, up on the screen, it might take you 200 milliseconds. I don't remember the precise numbers. But if I had flashed the word FLOWER prior to it, you were primed by flower. Flower was linked to rose, and you wound up taking only 150 milliseconds instead of 200 milliseconds to recognize the word rose. And as a matter of fact, it was really weird, because if I gave you the word wheat after giving you the word FLOWER, you'd recognize it more rapidly, because flower is a homophone of flower, and wheat is made into flour, and things like that. So these crazy psychologists did all that sort of stuff. They even got tenure for it, and eventually Danny got a Nobel Prize for better stuff than that. But one of the studies he was talking about was absolutely amazing about the priming effect. these guys had people given a list of 5 words, 20-year-old students at some university, given a list of 5 words. And the words would be something like, downstairs patients slowly newspaper walked. And your job, if you were one of the students, was to take those 5 words and pick 4 of them and make a sentence of those 4. So I read one, another might have been room front strode athlete confidently. You make a sentence using 4 of those words. Well, they had the people do that. And what the subjects didn't know was that half of them got a whole bunch of sentences that had to do with old people. And the other half got a whole bunch of things where the sentences they put together had to do with young people. And then after the experiment, the people were told, okay, here's a chit, go down the hall and use this to sign the paperwork that you'll get paid for the experiment. The real experiment was they're walking down the hall. Because it turned out that the people who made sentences that had to do with old people walked much more slowly down the hall than the people who made sentences that had to do with young people. Okay. Think about that when you listen to Niral, who's going to talk about subtle manifestations of race in classrooms, and think about what the implications of that might be.
Niral?
Before we begin, can you all hear that noise? Or is that just me? Okay, we need to fix that now, or else this is going to be a painful situation. You know, this happened when I don't know how it's tied to the video. Let's try this again. I don't know if anyone knows anything about how to fix this. You don't have a separate cable, do you? A video cable? Same with an extra.
I have one of these guys.
Is that a? Let's try that.
Is there an audio on?
Yeah, there is. There is, but it's actually this noise happens when I plug in the video.
Yay!
That sounds better because it's not there. Thank you. Okay.
It's on the
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Okay, Michael to the rescue. Thank you. Okay, so Alan, thank you very much for the introduction. I think it really sets up the work that you're about to hear pretty well. And thank you to everyone else for being here. I've been really looking forward to the opportunity to share my work with the GSC, my home community. The primary goal of my research program to date has been to build knowledge about how we can build equitable learning environments in STEM. And in particular, I'm interested in learning environments that can account for this particular subjective experiences of students from historically marginalized groups, and especially students of color. Now, to date, my work has taken me into high school math classrooms, which is what I'm going to talk about today, and into elementary computer science classrooms. So I'm going to focus on the former, but later when we have more of a discussion, I'm happy to talk about the computer science work as well. Now, I think about equity as a condition where every student in the classroom has access to the cognitive and social resources that he or she needs to learn. On an institutional level, scholars like Gary Orfield and Jeannie Oakes have identified persistent disparities in students' access to material resources for learning, like textbooks and excellent teachers, and also just access to the most rigorous courses available at their school. But there's also the matter of what's happening in classrooms day to day, and whether learning environments themselves are set up in a way that ensures that every student gets the resources they need to learn. And I think that until we understand the dynamics of equity at that classroom level, I don't believe that every child will have equal access to the same opportunities to learn. Now, from a theoretical standpoint, my approach to this research is predicated on situated and sociocultural perspectives on learning, which emphasize this relationship between learning, engagement, and identity. So let's say that starting tomorrow we woke up and all of these systemic inequities in STEM were suddenly gone. I would argue that if students are positioned, if some groups of students are positioned as less capable of learning in a particular domain, it's not guaranteed at all that those students are going to succeed in that subject. And the reason that is because they're prevented from accessing the resources they need to build productive domain identities. Now, research tells us that those identities are important because without them, students may not even engage or have the opportunity to engage in the learning process. And I think that's why it's so important we understand the factors that mediate students' identity formation in learning situations. Now today, I'm going to share findings from a study that focused on one facet of this complex problem, namely how race functions to position students in a STEM learning context. Now, to be clear, while I don't believe that race is the only thing that matters when we're talking about students of color in STEM, I think it's very difficult to talk about students of color without talking about race. Right? Now, we know that race and how it's been relevant in U.S. society has changed over time, but just because we elected a black president doesn't mean that race isn't an essential part of people's everyday lived experiences in the U.S. anymore. And I think what happens in STEM classrooms is situated within this racial context. And this piece of my research program aims to contribute to our understanding of this interaction. So I'd like to begin by sharing a piece of data from an interview I conducted several years ago. And it was with a 9th grade African-American boy named Derek. Now Derek was a high performer in his 9th grade geometry class. It's an advanced class. And he usually did well. And he talked about becoming a chemical engineer one day. And he told me about an interaction he had with another African-American classmate in that same geometry class, where the teacher is passing back their tests. And as usual, Derek had done pretty well. He got a good grade. And his friend looks over to him, and he sees that, and he's surprised. And what he tells him is, "Oh, you're hecka smart in math. You must have some Asian in you." Now, the reason I'm sharing this episode is because I think it raises important questions about the interaction between learning, identity, and race. Now, these boys were engaged in a very common classroom practice. All they're doing is comparing their test scores. Why does race even come up in that context? And on top of that, why does a narrative about Asians come up in the context of an interaction between two African-American boys? I think this also raises questions about what it might mean for the identities of math learners, and also their identities as African-Americans, as well as their long-term trajectories of engagement in the learning process. So the big question driving the study was this: how does race mediate the learning process in everyday classroom practice? Now, I chose mathematics as a context for the study because, as Alan and others have argued, math education has long since been a high-stakes domain and acted as a gatekeeper for many students, especially students of color. The other thing that interested me about mathematics is that compared with the other academic subjects out there, it's actually one of the few subjects for which an explicit racial narrative exists, and I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later. So that's the broad scope of the study. Now we'll turn to the theoretical foundation of the work. First, I'm going to discuss the relationship between learning and identity, and then talk a little bit about how I see race mediating that interaction. Now, sociocultural theory has proven extremely useful in studying how learning happens. A central premise of the sociocultural perspective is that learning happens in negotiation with the social world, as individuals deploy artifacts in practice to achieve certain goals. And these artifacts can be material, like a calculator, but they can also be non-material, like language or like an algebraic representation. Now, through this process, which occurs with people engaged in the social practices that make up human activity, a mutual transformation takes place that can lead to new understandings. Etienne Wenger has argued that in the process of learning, it's not just people's knowledge that's getting transformed, but it's also identity, right? So learning is a process of becoming, as well as the process of knowing. Now, researchers have applied sociocultural theory to the study of identity formation and learning context. For example, in their study of a high school track and field team, Niral Nasir and Jamal Cooks describe how a track runner's starting blocks, like the metal object that the runner puts his or her feet into, function as an identity resource. So in this community of practice, being able to use this metal object signified that you were ready to take on a position as an advanced runner. That's how you were understood yourself and how you were understood by the community. So on the one hand, while using the starting blocks was certainly adding to one's knowledge about running, it was also integral to building an identity as a learner, as a runner. But although the starting blocks were physically available for anyone to use, like on the field, the starting blocks were just sitting out there, the coach had some say over who got to use the starting blocks. So there were times when a runner would reach for the artifact, and in doing so would position him or herself as a runner with high potential. But sometimes the coach would say no, right? You're not going to use those starting blocks because you're not ready. And in doing so, would reposition the runner as someone without high potential, right? So that's that negotiation. So I think what this reveals is that identity formation is a two-sided process of positioning, the effect of which is identity. So there's actually not one thing called identity, right? It's a plural thing, because we participate at any given time in multiple communities of practice at the same time. For example, I'm a researcher, but I'm also an uncle, I'm also an American, I'm also a Cubs fan, right? So all of those things are things I juggle simultaneously. And rather than a stable trait, I follow Stuart Hall and others in understanding identities as fluid and provisional, which is why up on the slide, identities is in brackets. Just because the world positions you in a certain way, or that you position yourself in a certain way, doesn't mean that you're that person forever and always. Right? Now, I think this instability is actually a good thing, because if identities aren't fixed, that means that there's possibility for change. There's possibilities within any community of practice that you can adopt a new position, which will afford you new ways of engaging in the world. Now, where is race in all this? Race is often thought of as a demographic variable, right? As a set of categories we can use to organize human beings into groups. However, this perspective obscures the socially constructed nature of race. Race is not real in the biological sense. Right? Multiple scientific disciplines have clearly established that race is a concept that human beings invented sometime around the 15th century. And also that racial categories continue to mutate over time according to sociopolitical forces. But just because race isn't real doesn't mean we can't ignore it. It's exactly because race gets treated as if it were real that it continues to have material consequences for people in their everyday lives. So then, if race isn't a set of categories, what is it? Well, drawing on the work of the French theorist Michel Foucault, David Theo Goldberg argues that race can be thought of as a discourse, or a system of artifacts that individuals use to construct meaning about people, ideas, and social phenomena. Discourse in this sense means something more than language, right? It's more than just people talking to each other. Going back to the track and field example, recall that it's not just the language the coach uses to position the athletes in that community of practice, but it's also the physical object that factors into the positioning. Both can be understood as elements of the discourse of track and field, because both play a part in how the actors in that context come to understand what it means to be a runner and what it means to engage in this practice of running. Now, in schools and classrooms, what goes on in them is situated within broader racial discourses in society. Racial discourses are ways of talking about and making sense of groups of human beings that usually link phenotype to a particular behavior or a trait. Now, this frame emphasizes the social dimension of how race works, which is why in my work you'll hear me use the word narrative instead of stereotype, which has more of a connotation as an individual in the head kind of phenomenon. And so to summarize, the idea is that identity formation isn't just a local phenomenon. Rather, it's connected to broader discourses of race, class, gender, and so on. And in that sense, my research aims to understand this interaction between the micro and what's happening between the macro and what's happening at the micro level in classrooms. Okay, so now let me say a little bit about how this frame applies to this specific study of racial discourse in math learning settings. Now, for various reasons, mathematics is commonly thought of as a culture-free domain. However, this doesn't mean that the learning process itself, the learning of mathematics, is culture-free. And in fact, more than a decade of research by Danny Martin and others on the experiences of African-American math learners has shown that many students perceive their learning mathematics as intertwined with their identities as African-Americans, with their identities as racialized individuals. And consistent with the research on racialized institutional barriers, this body of work shows that participants consistently say that they've been denied access to advanced math courses because of their race. What I want to do in this study is to build on that work by looking at how race operates in the everyday environment of the mathematics classroom. Now, my approach to exploring this topic has been to conceptualize the math learning process as situated within what I call a racial mathematical discourse. This discourse makes available artifacts that facilitate student sense-making about what it means to do mathematics and to be a math learner in a racial context. Racial mathematical narratives, which are beliefs about how math ability is linked to race, are key artifacts of this discourse, which can be deployed in social interaction. And I think you can see this in the first episode I shared with Derek, right? The boys are engaged in a typical classroom practice in math class of comparing test scores, when a narrative about Asians being good at math is deployed that positions both of them with respect to math and with respect to race. Now, research on stereotype threat shows that under controlled experimental conditions, racial narratives can have a material impact on students' performance. In this study, I was interested in how those same narratives emerge as students engage in everyday learning situations in the naturalistic learning environment. And I'll also note that Asians are good at math is actually a pretty good starting point for my project because it's an explicit articulation of race and mathematical ability. And more than that, large-scale survey research has shown that there's widespread awareness in the US about this Asians are good at math narrative. So people know about it, and students know about it. Of course, this does raise the question of whether Asians are good at math is the only discursive artifact that matters, or if there are others. And this was one of the things that I wanted to explore in this research. So 3 research questions guided my inquiry. One, which narratives emerge in students' sense-making about race in the context of math learning? So in other words, I was interested in which artifacts does the discourse make available to students to potentially deploy in social interaction? Next, do students perceive math learning as a racialized process, and if so, how? The goal of this line of inquiry was to get at the particular classroom practices where students perceive race coming up. And last, how and for what purposes are racial mathematical narratives deployed in social interaction between students? This question was intended to learn more about the impact of racial mathematical discourse on students' identity formation. So the research was conducted at Eastwood High, which was a school specifically selected for its racial and ethnic diversity. I assumed that if students are confronted with racial difference, just visually, more often, that this might be a rich site for collecting the kind of data I needed to investigate my research questions. Participant observation was used to document racialized episodes that came up in classroom interaction. I recorded field notes for 96 observations over the course of a school year in 4 different math classrooms, where I occasionally circulated the room as a tutor, and I only intervened when students asked for my help. Now, there are 2 things worth noting about these particular classrooms. One is that the pedagogy was pretty standard, right? So kids would walk into the room, there'd be a warm-up, teacher would go over the homework from last night, there'd be a lecture, and then some time at the end for students to work on the homework for the next day. So occasionally they'd have group projects. For the most part, the classrooms were quiet and social interaction was pretty limited. Now, you might think that given my interest in racialized interactions, this was far from ideal. However, because the configuration of these classrooms was so similar to what a lot of math classrooms look like around the country, I hope that researching in these particular classrooms might give me broader insight into how race operates in context beyond the particular high school that I was situated in. And also, as we'll see, and I think this is something that Alan was alluding to in the introduction, just because students weren't talking about race or talking at all doesn't mean that race wasn't happening. In addition to the observational data, I conducted semi-structured interviews with students from those classrooms. And my goal was to understand the meaning students were making about race in the context of math learning. Each interview lasted about 35 minutes. Some went as long as 90 minutes. The interview protocol was split into two parts. The first half focused on students' personal histories learning math, their perceptions about what math is, what it takes to be good in math, and their own understanding of how they'd done in math to that point. And the second part of the interview focused on students' knowledge and perceptions of racial mathematical discourse. Of the students that gave permission, 35 were selected for the interviews. My goal wasn't to match the exact demographics, as you can see, of the school, but rather to make sure that students from each racial and ethnic group at the school were represented in the interview. So that's an overview of the study. I'll say more about my analytical approach as I go, but let me begin by discussing findings from the observational data. Now, altogether, I recorded 18 episodes of interaction where explicitly racial language was used. Now, averaged over 90 plus observations, that breaks down to about one explicitly racial episode per week of observation. This may not sound like a large number, and it isn't, but the relative low frequency of these explicitly racial episodes was actually not surprising. In previous observational studies of racial talk in educational settings, such as Michael Pollack's work at the high school level and Deborah Van Osdale's work at the preschool level, racial talk was also quite rare in those studies. And if racial talk occurred in the classroom setting as opposed to on the playground or in the hallway, it happened in response to something that was embedded in the curriculum that either directly or indirectly referenced race. Now, in this situation, because I was situated in these math classrooms, students, because of the curriculum, the nature of the pedagogy, students were often working on highly numerical or symbolic problems. So the same opportunities for race to come up in conjunction with the curriculum just weren't there. Now, it's kind of an interesting question whether in a more real-world style, kind of a contextual problem-based curriculum, if these kinds of episodes would come up more quickly, or more readily. I'll also say that the number of racialized episodes was less important to me than what a particular episode might illuminate about the form and function of racial discourse in these math classrooms. And just as a heads up, throughout the talk, I'll be shifting back and forth between talking about students from particular racial groups, like their own racial affiliations, and narratives about certain racial groups. Okay, so I'll be trying to signal that as I go but if you need any clarification, just let me know. Okay, so without going into too much detail, I'm going to just give you a quick sense of the kinds of episodes I documented in the field notes. The first two examples I'm going to share are examples of explicit race talk. So this first one, it happened when a white student named Paul was chatting with his pre-calculus teacher. And this might be a little small, so I'm going to just summarize and read the important parts if you can't see it. So he's talking with his pre-calc teacher, and he's like, Ms. Patterson, we have to play ping pong. And she's like, yeah, great. And he's like, I play ping pong. I'm like an Asian girl with ping pong. I'm a ping pong master. And she says, I'm going to take you down. Now, this kind of episode was typical among the explicitly racial episodes I documented, in that the race talk was embedded in some kind of intended joke. But there were other occasions when race talk was much more serious and occurred while students were engaged in some kind of learning-related practice. In this second episode, there was a day in this pre-calculus class where 4 students are working on a group project where they have to graph this rational function. So for the entire class, they spend most of the period working on the math, and now it's time to put it on a big poster paper because they're going to do presentations the following day. And so Karina is one of the girls who's about to start working on the poster, and she says, "Who took my marker?" And Tariq, a Middle Eastern boy, says, "Maybe it was Joey." Right? Joey was one of the other group members. He's black. Once I went home and my bike was stolen. It's in his nature to steal something. And he says this while he smiles and he looks at Joey. And Joey just smiles back and he doesn't say anything. Now obviously this is shocking and horrible. Outright bigoted statements like this were rare, but they did come up from time to time. I think it's very hard to say what impact an episode like this might have had on any of the students' identity and engagement, even though it occurred in the middle of a learning situation. At the very least, though, the existence of episodes like this, I think, suggests that even in a supposedly neutral subject like mathematics, in certain situations, race may still be in the air, as Claude Steele might put it. Now, besides the explicitly racial episodes in the observational data, I also flagged episodes in the field notes that might have been racialized for students, even though no racial language was used. The two examples I'm going to share were identified based on their potential intersection with the Asians are good at math narrative, which, as I noted earlier, research has shown to be widely recognized in the United States. So first I'm going to walk you through both episodes, and then I'll come back and talk about the methodological issues I think they raise. So the first one, this was a situation where students are engaged in a trigonometry lecture. And the teacher throws out an open-ended question to the class, asking them to figure out what the length of this missing side is. And one of the three South Asian males in the class, named Vishal, he instantly, without writing anything down, and without even looking away from the teacher, instantly gives the correct answer, 2 square root of 3. Now, when that happens, there's two students who are sitting in front of him who kind of turn around and look at him. Right? And then, over the next minute, Vishal answers some more questions correct, without writing anything down and without hesitating at all. And then one of the two students who turned around, a white student, turns around and says, "Vishal, I'm going to punch you." And he says this kind of in a laughing way, and then the teacher tells him to turn around and basically pay attention. Right, so that's the first episode. The second also involved not just one, but all three of the South Asian males in this class. So this is a test day in pre-calculus. And for, like most test days, the room's totally quiet. Right? Now with about 25 minutes to go, the first student gets up from his desk and then walks to the front of the room to turn in his test. And that happens to be Akshay, one of the three South Asian boys in the class. Over a 5-minute interval, the other two boys also turn in their test. And then there's a long gap of about 7 minutes where students are still working on their tests. And then only after that do other students get up and start to turn in their tests, and then eventually the bell rings. Now, to be clear, I'm not claiming that either episode was either racialized or not racialized. And in fact, that's exactly the point. We can't say for sure what's going on in these episodes, because with the observational data alone, we don't have access to the meanings that students were making of these classroom events. On the one hand, it's entirely possible that no one noticed that the three South Asian boys were the first ones to turn their tests out of a class of 25. Or when the two students turn around and one of them says later that I'm going to punch you, that it's really not about race, right? It could be about they thought he was showing off and they were annoyed by it, or maybe they were impressed that he could answer all these questions off the top of his head. Ultimately, these observational data, though, point to the importance of accounting for explicitly and implicitly racialized episodes, especially when those subtle manifestations of race may be emerging during typical learning situations, like taking a test or participating in a whole class discussion. What we need a better understanding of is students' subjective experiences in these kinds of situations, and that's what motivated the interview component of the study. So in discussing the interview data, I'm going to present two sets of analyses. One is related to cataloging the different racial narratives that came up in the interviews. What racial narratives were students aware of? And second, I'm going to examine the episodes that students identified where they saw those narratives coming up in class. So in the interviews, I asked students if they had heard people say that some groups are better than others at math. And almost every student interpreted this question in racial terms. In each interview, students alluded to a variety of narratives as they engaged in racial mathematical discourse. And I'll say that I was less interested in students' endorsement of these narratives, like if they said, "Oh yeah, I hear people say that Asians are good at math." I was less interested in whether they bought into that, and more interested in what narratives they were aware of. So for that reason, the questions were framed not so much in terms of what do you believe, but more in terms of what do you hear people say out there in the world. I wanted to map the discourse. So this was an example of some of the data that I got. And this is an excerpt from a Tongan student named Isaac, which was very typical of the data. So Isaac said, they think like just because Polynesians are so big that we don't know how to do math, they think we're dumb. Me and my brother and a couple other Polynesian students like Ray, we try to prove them wrong. Not that we're only big and good at sports, but we're also trying to tell them that we're also smart. So in terms of coding for these racial narratives in the data, any statement that basically was a concatenation of a racial affiliation with a particular behavior or trait was coded as a racial narrative. So in this example, I would code 4 racial narratives. One about Polynesians being big in size, another about them being bad at math, being dumb, and being good at sports. Right? And so if there were multiple instances within an interview of a student mentioning a narrative multiple times, that was only counted 1 time. So I extended this method basically over the entire data corpus of 35 interviews, and that yielded the following. So what you see here is a table of all of the racial narratives mentioned by the 35 students I interviewed, and it's organized by the topic of the narrative and also the group the narrative refers to. So the way to read this is, for example, this number right here, this 7. This means that 7 out of 35 students interviewed mentioned a narrative linking blacks to math or STEM ability. So for our purposes today, I'm just going to point out 2 major themes in these data. First, you'll notice that the majority of the narratives mentioned by students pertain to Asians. All 35 of the students interviewed reported awareness of the Asians are good at math narrative, corroborating some of the research that's already out there. What's noteworthy here, though, is that students connected this idea that Asians are good at math to narratives about Asians outside mathematics. Right? So they talked about this in the context of Asians being good at school in general, about being smart, about having good parents, this kind of thing. And all of this is consistent with the perception in the US of Asians being perceived as a model minority, something that surfaced during the 1960s and that persists today. Of course, there could be a number of reasons that the narratives students mentioned tended to be about Asians. I suspect that partially this was a function of the interview protocol, in the sense that it was designed to be flexible according to what students said. So because so many of them started with this Asians are good at math narrative, a lot of the follow-up questions probe students' reasoning about Asians. I think also it could be that they felt more comfortable talking about superficially positive narratives about one group as opposed to negative narratives about another group. Right? One of the things when you're talking to people about race is that they don't want to be perceived as racist. And something that kept coming up in the interview is that I tried to assure students that I'm not interested in how you think about these things in terms of your own personal beliefs, but what do you hear out there in the world? So that could be one reason why the narratives were skewed towards Asians. I also have to acknowledge that interviews are not neutral settings. It also is possible that my positionality as an Asian identified person who is good at math by virtue of my role as a helper in the class somehow triggered this focus on Asians in the interviews. However, I think that's if that were the only reason why they talked about Asians, it wouldn't explain why they were able to elaborate so extensively on narratives about Asians, and also, as we'll see, at times when those narratives came up in class. The other trend I'll point out here is along the top row, which shows that when students talked about mathematical ability, they didn't only mention Asians, they also mentioned narratives about the mathematical ability of other racial groups. And in fact, 71% of the students I interviewed noted the Asians are good at math in relation with a narrative about another racial group in math, usually positioning them as mathematically inferior.
What does STEM stand for?
Oh, I'm sorry. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So sometimes, for example, when students were talking about Asians are good at math, they might talk about a time where that came up in chemistry class. Or they might say something about Asians are good at science or technology. So that's like the broader umbrella category. So I think this relationality is important. And on a conceptual level, it kind of makes sense, right? If there's this belief out there that Asians are good at math, one group is good at math, it stands to reason that there should be at least one other group that's positioned as not as good as math, right, or bad at math. Now, there isn't enough data here to clearly determine if some groups were more often positioned as mathematically inferior, but it does suggest that for most of the students in this study, racial mathematical discourse applied to students of all racial and ethnic backgrounds, not just Asians. So this gives us a sense of the array of artifacts that might have been available to students to appropriate and deploy in social interaction. I then asked students if they could recall times where these narratives came up in class. Okay, so let me orient you to what you're seeing here. This is a chart of all of the 42 episodes that were coded in the interviews with the 35 students. So what you're seeing here is that every single student has a bar, and along the x-axis, these are the self-reported racial identifications of the 35 students. So all the self-identified Asian students are clustered together, all the Polynesian identified students are clustered together. And what the y-axis is representing is the number of racialized episodes that were coded for that student in the interview data. So, for example, this student, Sylvia, a Latina girl, her bar goes up to 3. That means in the interview, she reported 3 racialized episodes. Overall, 23 of the 35 students reported at least 1 racialized episode. Now, I find this to be a pretty remarkable number. Students were not told in advance the interview was going to engage issues of race. And yet 2/3 of the students could mention a particular time where they remembered race coming up. I think this finding is also an indicator that their awareness of racial narratives related to math learning wasn't just in their head, but that they perceived them emerging in classroom activity. The other thing I'll point out is the similarity in the within-group variation across the groups. So 2 things to note. One, if you notice across the different racial groups, there are students in every single group that reported at least 1 racialized episode. So there was no skew in this chart. If, let's say that racial mathematical discourse was only relevant to one group, like only one group saw it as relevant, what you would see is a skew in this chart. And the other thing I'll point out is that this includes white students right here. If, as race scholars have argued, like Zeus Leonardo and others, whites have a lot of racial knowledge, and I think this is reflected in here as well. I will say, though, that in a chart like this, I think we have to be a little bit careful. The number of racialized episodes that a given student reported shouldn't necessarily be interpreted as an indicator of how salient race was to them or the impact on their particular learning experiences. And as we're going to see in a little bit, sometimes a single incident in your life can be deeply impactful, and in this context can have a deep influence on your trajectory as a learner. So the next level of analysis I'm going to show here focused on parsing the content of the episodes. So the question is not just the lay of the land in terms of the number of episodes students shared, but what were these episodes about? And analysis revealed 3 major themes. First, the episodes broke almost evenly between interactions where students observed explicit race talk and episodes where nothing explicitly racial was said, but they read race into that particular classroom event. I think this lends more evidence to the claim that race may be playing out in subtle ways in classrooms. Second, the majority of the episodes reported by students were interactions involving Asian learners, which wasn't especially surprising given how much they talked about Asians being good at math and other narratives about Asians. The last point is that I was interested in knowing if there were patterns in the kinds of situations where students perceived the racialized episodes emerging. And what I found was that the episodes could be categorized as occurring in 3 typical classroom practices. Explaining a classmate's performance or enrollment in class, we saw that with the Derek episode, asking classmates for help, and noticing patterns in whole class participation. Now, in a moment, I'm going to show some exemplar data, but I'll note that 2 of the 3 classroom practices, the ones in yellow, are regular aspects of the learning process in most classrooms. This was somewhat unexpected. I didn't expect the episodes to cluster on classroom practices in this way. Now, certainly this is only preliminary evidence, I'm not claiming that these are the only classroom practices where race comes up. However, it does support the hypothesis from the observational data that race may be emerging in practices associated with learning. So having described the major themes at a top level, I'm going to shift now into a qualitative analysis of a few episodes in order to illustrate the implications these interactions might be having on students with respect to identity formation. Okay, so this first episode was reported by a pre-calculus student named Serena, who identified as Pakistani. She was in the Eastwood High Math Club, and the math club would give tutoring, like school-wide tutoring, every day at lunch. And so anyone could go and get tutoring in a math room. And here she's going to describe an incident she noticed during one of those lunchtime tutoring sessions, which involved explicit racial talk, and had to do with learners getting asked for help in math. Here, so we can get the audio.
Well, like, because we do tutoring, so people would come up to us and be like, oh, I'll just go to like the Asian, leave the other people, because we have Latinos and we have one black kid and like a couple of white people.
Right.
So they'd go to the Asians rather than go to the It's like, oh, you should know.
Now, recalling the conceptual frame I presented at the beginning of the talk, I think this episode can be understood through the lens of appropriating and deploying artifacts to achieve particular goals. In this case, students walk into the room and they're looking for a tutor, and they appropriate this Asians are good at math narrative and deploy it to help them decide who to ask for help. With respect to identity and positioning, this might seem like a good thing for the Asian learners in the room. I mean, after all, they're getting positioned as mathematically competent, maybe smart in general. But what happened was that none of the Asian students I interviewed were particularly happy about being positioned at the top of this racial hierarchy of mathematical ability, as Danny Martin calls it. Quite the opposite, they actually tended to be annoyed by it, or they resented it altogether. Or one student reported it as a source of undue pressure that he couldn't really live up to. Now this is consistent with research in ethnic studies on how Asians are perceived in general in this country and their experience of that. And you can imagine if you were the one that everyone was going to for help or to copy their math homework, you might start to feel that the only reason they're going to is because they see you as a source of answers or this kind of information repository. My point is that while superficially a compliment, it's not at all clear that Asians are good at math is even a good thing for Asians. How they're positioned as math learners, as students, and also as people. It's also noteworthy here how Serena frames the interaction. Because you notice how she says that students go to the Asian students rather than the Latino, black, and white students. I think this is another example of how the discourse operates in relational fashion. By asking one racial group of students for help, you don't just position that racial group, but you also negatively position the groups that you aren't asking for help. This next episode was reported by James, who was an African-American student. And here he recalls an interaction from the first day of pre-calculus class that year, which from his point of view was implicitly racialized.
Hey, or whatever. Like, I would get questions like, oh, you're in this class? Like, yeah, yes I am. You know? Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really trip. I looked at it for a second, I was like, I just kind of looked it off, like, I don't even care.
Now, the experience James recalls here has to do with belonging, right? Which students belong in which classes. This is something that many students of color from historically marginalized backgrounds, in particular, face on a regular basis. Now, again, we don't know what his classmates intended, or what they were thinking when they said, you're in this class. They do seem surprised, though, that James is in pre-calculus. But from the question alone, we can't be sure if that surprise is a racial surprise. And I would argue that it doesn't serve us well to assume that there is an objective quality to these interactions that can be determined. Instead, I argue that what matters isn't how words or actions are intended, but rather how students take them up from their subjective points of view. Here, James understands this interaction as racialized, he takes up his classmates' question as a deployment of racial narratives about African Americans being not good at math, or maybe also not being good at school in general. And he responds by deploying a counter-narrative of his own by saying, yes, yes I am. Now, having classmates be surprised or having classmates outright challenge a student's mathematical ability, this was typical of the racialized episodes involving non-Asian learners. Carlos was a 12th grader in pre-calculus, and he reported an incident that occurred 6 years prior, when he was 11 years old in the 6th grade. He told me that one day he got a C on a test, and some classmates told him that this made sense, and it was proof that he was just a dumb Mexican. In other words, racial narratives were used to make sense of his performance. But here's a case that gives us some reason for hope, that counter-narratives can be deployed to resist how these macro-level discourses position students.
A Mexican that doesn't know how to do math.
Yeah.
You know? So, that was one of the main reasons why I want to do the best, was to show people that, Mexicans are smart and they don't just work and do guardian stuff all the time.
Right.
Now, Carlos was actually one of the top students in this class, and what he was able to do is admirable. Angela Valenzuela calls this positive resistance, right? Succeeding in order to prove people wrong. And not only is he trying to reposition himself as being a different type of math learner, but he's also trying to re-articulate what it means to be a Mexican in a schooling context, and specifically within mathematics. Students like Carlos prove every day that it is possible to succeed in math and in school despite being positioned as inferior in a subject. But if all students were able to do this on a regular basis, none of this discussion or none of these findings would be of concern to us as educators. Obviously, we can't expect marginalized students to counter these positionings on their own. What we need is to continue to find ways to institutionalize the resources needed for students to effectively deploy counter-narratives. Now, before I close, I'd like to revisit one of the interactions I mentioned earlier that I documented through the classroom observation. So this is the one where the 3 South Asian boys in the class were the first to turn in their tests. Now, as I said before, we can't confirm or reject, based on the observational data, whether that was a racialized episode for any of the students in the room. But as it turned out, this very episode came up spontaneously in my interview with the first boy to turn in his test, named Akshay. So I'd like to play some audio of what he said.
I just thought it was 3 Indian dudes. Come on, that was just my opinion. And then I pointed out, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, they're Indian. They have this and that." And I was like, "Ah, you're an idiot because you were struggling."
So after class, you pointed this out to other students, and they said that?
Oh no, just in general, it's like my friend was like, "Yo, did you realize the first 3 people in class that were done with the test were Indians?" Like, I don't know, and he was just babbling on about how many of them explore.
So it turns out that in this case, there was confirmatory evidence that for at least Akshay and his classmate Rico, the practice of who turned in their tests in this particular situation was racialized. The racial narrative functions as a kind of cognitive schema, as a lens through which they construct meaning for a given event. Again, this doesn't mean that the incident was racialized for everyone in the room, or that it was racialized in the same way. But I think this episode is interesting because of the methodological issues it raises. I think observational data like this episode points to an important question. What counts as legitimate data in a problem space such as this one? If we don't have students' confirmation that a given event was racial from their point of view, then does it count as relevant data? If you're going to count interactions where race wasn't explicitly vocalized as relevant, then what criteria should we use to identify them? Now, I can't say that I have solid answers yet to these questions, and what I presented here today may be the beginnings of an approach, but I think as a field it's important we keep these issues on the table. So to summarize the findings of the study, the data show that in addition to being more an individual or in-the-head phenomenon, racial narratives also play an active role in the classroom setting. And there's preliminary evidence that the narratives emerge as students engage in practices linked to learning. which can play out in explicit and implicit ways. Finally, I offer the notion of relationality, which suggests that racial mathematical discourse isn't just about Asians, but that it's relevant to students of all racial backgrounds. In terms of the implications of the work, this research complements other work on racial disparities in performance outcomes and institutional barriers by showing how race can mediate interaction at the classroom level. And consistent with a growing body of scholarship, I think it raises the possibility that being black, being white, or Polynesian, and so on, in a math classroom may be fundamentally different learning experiences with respect to positioning and identity. That's not because of anything innate in the children, but rather because of the ways that racial mathematical discourse constructs students with respect to mathematical ability. Also, this research highlights some of the ways that the learning process is situated not only within the local context of the learning setting, but also within broader discourses that circulate in society. Coordinating these multiple levels of context continues to be a challenge that the field must pursue if we're to build robust models of learning. Limitation of the study is that because the data come from one school, we do need to be cautious about generalizing to other contexts. I'm very interested to know the dynamics of race, how they might play out in different classrooms with more social interaction, and also other demographic contexts. Would this look the same in a school with only Asian and white students? Would it look the same in a school with only Latino students? And in those contexts, I think it's interesting because those are situations where they might not visually be confronted with racial difference on a daily basis. But at the same time, they're still hearing everything that's going on in the school and outside the school. And so how might that look same or different? And the other thing is that much of the data in this study focused on student-student interactions. But I think teachers are a critical part of this story. If we knew how teachers are making sense of these racial narratives, and also whether they notice these implicit patterns of racialization in their classrooms, I think we'd have a better handle on what this all means for teacher knowledge and also for teacher preparation. Doing this work has been incredibly intellectually stimulating, and this particular study has generated new hypotheses and lines of inquiry that I'm excited to pursue. One important issue this study highlights was that race can affect classroom activity in subtle ways. I think this raises methodological questions about how we can identify these implicit patterns of racialization. And this is something that I've been working on over the last year with a grad student here, Evie Baldinger. I think it also points to the need to develop new ways of measuring if and how students are noticing these phenomena, and whether racialized interactions are affecting their longitudinal engagement in the learning process. I've also been thinking about how discourses of race interact with other discourses of gender, of class, and so on. I think moving towards an intersectionality frame can get us closer to understanding students' learning experiences as situated within these broader social contexts. Finally, in my more recent work in computer science education, where I collaborate with Colleen Lewis, who also came through Berkeley and is now in the computer science department at Harvey Mudd College, I'm moving in the direction of design and design-based research. The big question driving that work is, what is the relationship between the configuration of a learning environment and the emergence of macro-level discourses? The question is the emergence of racial narratives or gender narratives, is that inevitable? Or can classrooms be restructured in ways that reduce the opportunities for those narratives to get invoked in classrooms? Now, I firmly believe that these societal discourses and how they play out are not deterministic. I think they're always refracted through the particular learning environment and how the practices of that environment are structured. And when that happens, I think a local discourse within a classroom, anyone who's taught or just been a student in a classroom knows this. In a local classroom, a local discourse gets built about what it means to be successful, what it means to be competent, what it means to be smart. And I think that is the case with racial discourses as well. And I think that should give us all some reason for optimism, that classrooms themselves can be sites to foster equity and not just perpetuate inequity. So I'd like to acknowledge all the mentors and intellectual communities that I've been part of and supported me in my work. I'm very grateful to them. I would not be here without them. And thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. I'll unplug this so we can spare our ears. Questions?
So I was waiting to you got to subjective experience because it seems like that's really, really important. So I'm kind of interested in how you think you might study that, and in particular whether that's a sociocultural, whether you would frame that from a sociocultural point of view.
So I think one way to get at the subjective experience is through the interview method, which is a big focus of this work. But I think what I wanted to do in the middle of the study, when I started to interview students and had a hunch that there were certain classroom practices, more than others, they were perceiving in racial terms, is if I could go back in time, I would either ask particular questions about particular classroom practices, or something in future work I've been thinking about is, what if you showed a classroom video without prompting it ahead of time, where students are either engaged in a whole class discussion, or let's say they're all seated and they're taking a test and some students get up and turn in a test. Show students a video of something like that and then find out whether they understand that. What do they read into that? Do they read race into that? Do they read gender into that? Other discourses? And I think that's another way of getting at student subjective experiences that would be more targeted. And to your question about applying a sociocultural frame on that, so can you say more about that?
I don't find that particular a question that is very well represented in either cognitive or sociocultural perspective. So I was tossing that up to see whether you would say, oh, I study things using a social. So is that? Sounds like that might be a no.
Yeah, I mean, well, it depends on what grain size you use it, right? So I think one way of thinking about how I've been thinking about it in the study is that sociocultural theory helps us to identify which artifacts are getting taken up in a given context, right? So I think that's one lens you can use on it. Now, to collect data on whether these patterns are happening, that's separate than the question of student subjective experiences of those events. But I think a sociocultural approach can also uncover some of that. For example, if you collect long-term video of a given classroom, you can systematically identify who's asking questions, who's answering questions, who's participating in whole class discussions, who students go to for help. And that would be a way of collecting data on some of those implicitly racialized phenomena. But I think this issue about getting students' subjective experiences, I think the best way to do it is to set up a context where you can ask them specifically about those kinds of things.
Just a quick follow-up. I think emotional response is just hugely important here. And I'm not sure that you would get anything much if you didn't specifically focus that. You would get some description about some sort of object. I mean, we can read some of that into these, but probably not very well. The African American kid who said "do whatever," we can probably read that, but maybe we need better theories of that, and the methodology for understanding the connections between emotions and these things that we see. I think that's up in the air as far as I'm concerned.
You know, the other thing, Andy, about getting at student subjective experience is that we have to acknowledge that people don't always know what's happening to them, right? Like, I think the work on stereotype threat is pretty illuminating about this, that if you were going to interview those people who were involved in those studies where their performance dropped because they're cueing of some stereotype, I don't think they would tell you that, oh yeah, this is what I was thinking, it made me feel pressure and then I did poorly in the test. They might tell you that, oh, I just took a math test and that was the end of it.
Yep. So my reaction is, yeah, that's why we need to theorize that.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Specifically, what questions did you ask the students, and how many?
There were probably maybe 8 questions in total. So the first half were focused on kind of their math autobiographies. So I asked them just to tell me, well, how do you see yourself as a learner in mathematics? I asked them targeted questions about mathematics, like who can be good at mathematics, how does math compare to other subjects? In the second half of the interview, the pivot question was what I showed you. Have you heard people say some groups are better than others in math? And then I had a string of follow-ups. I'm happy to share the protocol with you later if you're interested.
You focus a lot on student-student interactions. Maybe in the future studies, are you hoping to look more at teacher-student interactions, maybe classroom practices? Because there's been some gender studies where teachers call on
That's right,
boys
yeah.
and girls to different ways.
Yeah, I mean that's a clear logical next step for the work. And I have to say I was a little surprised. In the 42 episodes that I coded in the interview data, I expected more students to tell me something like, yeah, this teacher always favors this student, and it's racial. And I think that only happened twice. I think only 2 of the episodes I identified were about that. And that really surprised me. So I think digging more into how teachers are perceiving their classrooms. As Alan said, I'm a former math teacher. And I have to say, everything I've learned through this work so far is not stuff that was on my mind when I was in the classroom. So, and I had a very strong equity orientation. I wanted to make sure that every kid was getting what they need. And I was looking at my classroom in racial terms of mainly who was in my class. If my calculus class was representative of the school writ large, I felt like I was doing the right thing. I felt like my class was equitable. So I think we need to know more about how teachers are perceiving their students and their classes, and whether they're seeing what their students are seeing.
So in the slide showing your future work, you had a bullet there about your current research on the configuration of learning environments and the relation to broader discourses and things like that. And it looks like there's a hypothesis in there, that they're related. Do you have any emerging conjectures on how?
Yeah.
What do you...
Well, here's the thing, right? So, obviously there were only 2 or 3 classroom practices that basically came out when I coded for that in the episodes. But I asked myself, what is it about these particular classroom practices that might be ripe for the emergence of racial discourses? And my running conjecture so far, and I think this is the kind of thing I want to build a study around, is what if, there's a lot of classroom practices that happen in any given 60-minute class. But what if there's certain ones that are more likely to give opportunities for students to signify high intellectual status, right? Like, think about it. Asking classmates for help, turning in your test first, right? These are things where students are signifying some sort of competence, not because there's something inherent to the practice, but how we understand learning to be set up and how it usually is instantiated in a given classroom. So my hypothesis is this, that if we can identify certain classroom practices that are more likely to trigger that kind of, or give opportunities for students to be identified as smart or good at math, what if we can figure out ways to reconfigure those particular practices? Like, for example, you can imagine that, in this room, the practice when you're done with your test is to physically get up and then walk to the front of the room and hand your test to the teacher. That's how it is in most classes, right? And that seems fairly innocuous. But what this is just one data point. But what it makes me think about is, what if there were a classroom where that wasn't the way you did things, right? Like, what if everyone just turned in their tests at the same time, so there wasn't that public display of competence happening? Would that make it less likely for these kinds of discourses to emerge? So that's kind of where I'm at with that. And I think it seems to make sense to me. I think there might be something there, but we'll see.
I guess I have a sort of not fully formed question, but something about like the balance. I'm sort of getting at what you were just saying, like between for teachers and students to think about like what the right level of awareness of this sort of like these questions is. Like, I'm a Max B student, so I'll be teaching in 2 years, and this is something that I personally like really grapple with, is like what's the like right form and amount of sensitivity to where I'm like addressing issues rather than exacerbating trends or like any of these ideas that we think are in the ether. And so like I wonder if there's like research or some sort of response that research can offer to support teachers in that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think even from the learning sciences perspective, like what's happening with students in this learning process, on this particular issue, there isn't a whole lot yet. So I think that's one reason why on the teacher education side, we don't exactly know what this means. But I hear in your question, what do I do about this? Like, do I hit this head on in classrooms? For example, like, would you go into class and say, look, everybody, I know there are these stereotypes about Asians being good at math, but that's just not true. Anyone can be good at math. It's not a genetic thing. Or do you not hit it head on and then just try to look for it? Maybe you have someone come and observe you in your classroom to see if these kinds of patterns are emerging. And I don't have a good answer to that yet. But I think for teachers, that is the question, right? If we're aware of these things and what they might be doing for students, what do you do about it? And at what level, like you said, what level of sensitivity or directness do you broach it with your students? Yeah.
So, I was thinking in the beginning of the talk, I was wondering how the study would look differently if instead of looking at how race mediates learning, if racism was something that was looked at in the same kind of light. So I was wondering how you think about racism in relation to race, and sort of towards the end of the talk when you mentioned how the Asians are good at math narrative is even potentially harmful for Asian students. I was thinking that maybe the frame of race allows you to examine all student experiences and maybe not just focus on marginalized students, but I was wondering how that was coming up in your...
Yeah. Also, the term racism is, at this point in the history, not just of research on the topic, but also the history of the country. I mean, racism is such a loaded term that I think it really depends how you're going to conceptualize it, right? I mean, just about from week to week, something will happen in the news about race. And if you notice, the way the question is framed about how we should understand the event is whether it was racist or not, right? Paula Deen. Was Paula Deen racist or was Paula Deen not racist? And I think how, in kind of the public domain, how we understand racism is when someone makes an explicitly bigoted remark, right? They use the N-word. They say this or that, right? Now, racism in educational research, another way people use it is by looking at outcomes, right? So looking at, let's say in this school, all of the Asian and white students were in pre-calculus. This was not the case in this school. In pre-calc and calculus, and all the Black, Latino, and Polynesian students were in the lower level classes. Someone might come along and say that, well, whatever's leading to that, if there's some policies, those are racist policies, right? So that's another way of thinking about it. How I think about it is that I prefer not to use the term racism to describe that for this very reason, that I think it's a very loaded term. So what I prefer in my work is to use the term racially inequitable. So if there's an outcome that's showing that pattern, I think it's racially inequitable. And I think it's incumbent upon us to bring some more weight to what it means to be a racial inequity. Like, that's a very serious issue, even if we're not using a really intense word like racism. Now, to your second point there, I intentionally focused on race for the very reason you said, which is I was interested in how this stuff is affecting students of all racial backgrounds. Now, Asians, in a mathematics context, not in other contexts, in a mathematics context, Asians are students of color who are not a historically marginalized group, and not recently either. And I think there's a bit of my study, because I included white students in the study, that I think that what they're saying and how they're making sense of things, I don't have enough data to make any large claims about it, but I think that's the kind of thing that's interesting to follow up on as well. And I think by taking that broad frame, it allows you to kind of broaden your perspective beyond the particular experiences of one racial group, which is what a lot of the research has done.
So it feels like clearly these racialized narratives are at play. I'm curious to know, when you ask students about, like, what does it mean to be good at math and are you good at math, if you were able to make connections in what you coded between, like, how they saw these narratives and then how they saw themselves.
Yeah, I thought about running an analysis like that. I still might go back and do that. One issue I ran into is that the self-reports. So I asked students to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 of how they see themselves as math learners. And then I also said, well, how would other people rate you? And I think I had this idea that I could maybe draw some sort of relationship. But when I went back and looked at those data, I couldn't figure out how to calibrate across different students what it means for one student to rate themselves as a 7 as opposed to someone else who rated them as a 5. And the other thing is, one of the students I interviewed was basically the top student in her AP Calculus class, and she rated herself as a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. And other people I interviewed spontaneously mentioned this student as evidence that Asians are good at math. So I wasn't sure, I wasn't quite sure how to make sense of those data. But I think in a follow-up study, I would probably use some sort of survey, something broader that would apply to multiple classrooms to see if there's any relationship between those two. Anyone else?
Just a tiny follow-up on
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Isn't the differential the obvious thing to look at between how they rated themselves and how they expect other people to rate them?
Say more.
Oh well, you're saying you're having trouble with the absolute value of things.
Yeah.
And I'm saying, well, but it's the relative that's the important thing here.
Mm-hmm.
It's their view of themselves versus how they think other people look at them. That's the most important thing.
Right.
So I just do statistics on the difference.
On the difference. Okay.
Really stupid little idea, but there you are.
Andy, there's no stupid ideas coming from you.
I don't know if he asked how students perceive me, or did you? Like,
I did.
Oh, so you have both of those. Okay.
I did, yeah.
Oh, cool.
But the other thing, it gets complicated because students, how people perceive them in mathematics, that might vary depending on what math class they're in. And in fact, their own self-rating might vary. I remember some students told me that, well, I used to think I was a 9, but this year I'm a 3. Right? Like, what does that mean, right? When, if you're trying to make a relationship between, let's say, even the differences and these racial narratives, and how students make sense about them, the whole point of these racial narratives is that they simplify everything. That they're blanket statements about how entire groups are in a given subject on any day, in any class, at any time. So how do you make a connection between that and what one student might be experiencing when you interview them or when you survey them? I don't know. I mean, it gives me a lot to think about, but I'm not sure.
I would note two things. The first is that you also have objective data on their performance in class, or at least I assume you do. And it would be interesting to triangulate that with the two sources of data on perceptions. Because and you'd assume that the kids who do well on test scores are known for it, et cetera, but it would be interesting to see how well those things line up. The second thing I'd note is that we've reached the witching hour, and it's time to thank Niral for the talk and all the issues that it stimulated for us.